Good morning. All right, let's get started. We're going to try something a little bit different. We're going to have live captions going at the top for those of you that helps. And if not, just ignore them. So, here we go. Age of Exploration. This is going to be a brief introduction. This is not, the expectation here is not that you're going to understand everything, because we're going to be talking about it for kind of the rest of the school year and then the beginning of next year. So this is not something where we need to get everything perfect right now, but I do want to clear up a couple things and introduce a couple topics. Fact. We have to unlearn some things you may have misheard early on, or maybe even been taught in elementary school. By the time in 1492 that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, virtually everyone who was educated in the entire Western world, meaning all of Europe, pretty much knew that the world was round and not flat, shaped like a ball, a sphere, whichever term you prefer. Nobody was buying that whole flat earth thing in Europe, and Europe was kind of the last one to the party, honestly. People in Europe had only known that since around 400 BC. The Middle East had known it about 200 years earlier in 600 BC, and Asia had known that since about 800 BC. So by the time Columbus rolls around in 1492, to say that people thought the world was flat is a gross mischaracterization. People had known that the world wasn't flat for over 1,000 years at that point, and in some places of the world, more than 2,000 years. So, why the confusion? Well, known and could prove were two different things, and no one had managed to circumnavigate the world. That means to sail around it by that point. Now, eventually we'll get to a guy named Magellan, and he does actually manage to do that. Well, his crew actually does manage to do that, so you do have a circumnavigation, which then kind of permanently proves that the world is a sphere. But in terms of the knowing, how do you know if you can't prove it? Well, they knew mathematically, and for another number of other reasons that we'll talk about as well. But let's take a look at some of those things. So this is a world map from Greeks and around 520 BC. Now, they did have some stuff wrong. So even though they did believe that the world was round and shaped like a sphere, they essentially thought the back side of the world was just water. So there wasn't, like the American continents in North and South America, they had no knowledge of those. And so if you look, remember, there's no satellite, there's no way to fly over. Essentially, the farther you move away from Greece, the worse the map gets, which, to be fair, makes sense. Their knowledge of the world is based primarily on the places that the Greeks are going to and trading with. So, things like Italy and their part of the Mediterranean are rather well formed. You have things like the Nile River Delta. All of its branches are represented. You have the seas of the Arabian Peninsula represented correctly. You have the Tigris and Euphrates in about the right spot. Most things are pretty good, including things like Sardinia, Corsica. Those things are very well represented in the map. North Africa, Libya, Carthage, those are represented rather well. You get over to Spain and you start to get a little bit rough, and at this point, yeah, you don't have British Isles, you don't have Northern Europe depicted in any way, shape, or form correctly, and you don't have the southern portion of Africa depicted well either. You do have part of the Indus River depicted, but of course the Indian subcontinent is not presented well either. But this is 520 BC, 520 years before the time of Christ, so you're talking about like 1492. That's a long stretch of the legs, folks. So, 1491. Now, this is called the Hammer Map. This map was done by Heinrich Hammer. He was a cartographer. and a contemporary of Columbus. Remember, Columbus also a cartographer, both map makers here. So this map is before Columbus's journey. And if you look, I'm going to have a couple other versions that you may be able to see things a little bit better now. But you can see that the map has improved some things quite a bit. You do have Spain and Portugal now. You have the northern coast of France. You do have the British Isles. You have some of the Scandinavian countries. You have much more of Asia being presented. You do have some kind of extreme distortions, but for the most part, this is a much better map than the one we were looking at a minute ago in a lot of ways. Now, this is a false color map. They did a number of deep scans of this, and then they changed the color so you could kind of look at other elements. Just to kind of show you guys a couple different versions, see if there's anything that jumps out a little bit better for you. I think this one probably shows the land features the best out of all of them, the false color too. But this is a simplified version of what you see on the map. Now, there are some definite problems. If you look Africa, the west coast of Africa, the shape is kind of right but exaggerated. The east coast of Africa is very wrong. You're missing the horn, essentially. You're missing Madagascar. The shape of India is incorrect, but the Indus and the Ganges are both depicted with some fidelity. If you look, it kind of, as with the last one, it gets worse the farther you move away from Europe, because these are European map makers. You're going to do well in the area that you live, hopefully. So, here is an earth apple. An earth apple is another term for a globe. It's the German word. So this one is contemporary to Columbus, contemporary to 1492. Does not show the Americas, so this is essentially when Columbus is departing. Now, if you look, he has his globe. The back half of the world is essentially, if you look at the flattened out version of this earth apple there on the right, essentially he has the info, but this stuff here is all water again. And so you come to kind of the idea that Columbus is operating under. Nobody had failed to sail the way that he did because they thought they were going to fall off the world and die. The world is flat, you're going to fall off the edge. Nobody thought that. What they did think was the world is big, and their thought was the back was all water, which is why he believed he could sail from Europe, keep going west, and hit India, and of course Asia and whatnot. Which, to be fair, he's not wrong. You can circumnavigate the globe. The issue is going to become there's not enough time. As far as all the calculations that people have run on the globe by Columbus's time, they're like, you can't put enough food on your boat, your ship, sorry, Navy friends, on your ship to make it. There simply is not enough time for you to sail from Europe around the back of the globe and get to India before you run out of food and die, or run out of water and die. So the issue becomes, it's not a question of, are you going to sail off the edge of the world? It's a question of, you're not going to get there in time. Now, Columbus is a cartographer. He's doing his calculations a little bit differently than most people. He thinks the world is a little smaller. Still think the world is, whole back is water. But essentially, everybody else is operating under the idea that the world is like a basketball. And he's like, no, I think it's more like a volleyball. So it's still about the same size, but it's noticeably smaller. And so with his calculations being what they are, he thinks he can make it. So here you have it. He's got his little thing there. And so he's having trouble finding somebody to finance his voyage. because everybody else's calculation says basketball world, you're not going to make it. So it's a bad investment. They're going to pay for ships, they're going to pay for supplies, they're going to pay for sailors' salaries, they're going to put forth all this money just to have these guys die out on the ocean somewhere. So that's an issue. And so Columbus is going, no, guys, the world is like the size of a volleyball, not a basketball. I can totally make it if you give me enough money. Just give me the money and the ships and I can go. Now, if he's right, the reward is huge. The spices coming out of India will pay for the voyage many times over if you can bring back a ship with spices aboard. But the issue is, nobody wants to put forth the money. No one wants to front the money because it sounds like a really dumb bet. He's like, I can make it, and everybody's like, no, you really can't. So, this is a watercolor of the caravels at La Rabida. Of course, we don't actually have lovely pictures of Columbus's ships or anything like that. But what we do have is this lovely picture here of mock-ups of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria that were made for the 400th anniversary at the World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. It was held in Chicago. And the kind of castle behind it, not the one in the distance flying the flag, but the near building with the crosses on top, that is a scale model of La Rabida. La Rabida is a friary, a place where friars live, like monks, in Spain. And basically, after Columbus goes a number of places and is told no a number of places, he ends up here. He goes to see the King and the Queen of Spain, Fernando y Isabella, Ferdinand and Isabella, and he's going to ask them to commission his voyage, to buy the ships and provide all the upfront starting cash. And he's put off for 2 years. And so for 2 years, he has to try to convince the monks, the friars, who live at La Rabida, that he is not a crazy person. And so for 2 years, Columbus, the cartographer, argues with these very learned monks, many of whom are cartographers themselves, about if the world is really, this big or this big. Is it the size of a basketball? Is it the size of a volleyball? Not literally, obviously, but, relatively speaking. And so it does take him 2 years. Here's the actual Franciscan Friary of La Rabida. And after 2 years, he convinces them enough that they're like, maybe. We don't think you're right, but we don't think you're crazy. So he convinces the Queen's confessor, one of her trusted confidants, that he should get an audience with the Queen. Columbus gets his audience with the Queen. Queen gives him ships and whatnot, and he goes. Now, if you do recall from elementary school, they probably told you that he had a hard time finding crew. Absolutely true. Not because they thought they were going to fall off the world, but because they were all of the impression that the world was the size of a basketball and they were all going to die of starvation and or dehydration and or both somewhere in the middle of the ocean on the back of the world. Which, by the way, would have happened if he had not run into the years. So, there's that. So Columbus ends up getting many of his sailors out of jails and prisons. Essentially, he gets criminals and they're offered a pardon if they go along. So, now Columbus, by the way, is convinced that he is right, to the point where even when he hits land, he's still convinced that his smaller sphere plan is right, which is why he calls the natives he encounters Indians, which is why Native Americans, for many, 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 many years, and sometimes still today, are called Indians. Because Columbus doubled down on being wrong. He was like, oh yeah, I totes made it. Yay! So, This leads to the tribes of the Americas being called Indians, and then American Indians, and then like the people of India being called Eastern Indians by us, even though like it literally is India. And we kind of accidentally borrowed the word because Columbus was wrong. And eventually people decided that like Native American was a better term, but that's problematic because they're not native to here either. They're pre-Columbian Asian immigrants. So they just like came over from Asia a long time before Columbus. So pre-Columbian Asian immigrants is really, really long to say. So probably the best term in terms of accuracy and whatnot would probably be to use the term that's very popular in Canada for tribes, which is First Nations, because they were the groups that established the First Nations in the Americas. That's probably about as good a term as you're going to get, which is why you'll see me use that one a lot in 7th and 8th grade. Now, who found it first? Because when you're a little kid, you say, Columbus found America, but he really didn't, especially since he thought it was India. So the First Nations, the Native Americans, whichever you prefer, came to the Americas from Asia sometime in prehistory. So that means before recorded history. Historians place this event somewhere around maybe 30,000 BC or as recently as 4,000 BC. We don't really know for sure. We don't have a good, this is the time. We speculate that they probably crossed the Bering Strait on a land bridge that existed at the time. Otherwise, they island hopped, which the numbers of migrations we believe caused all this doesn't really jive with that. But it is technically possible to sail from Asia, even in little tiny boats, to northern Alaska and be in North America, which is essentially the same place that the Bering Land Bridge was. It's just a little bit farther down, closer to the Aleutian Islands, Big Diomede and Little Diomede Island, which, by the way, if you're on Little Diomede Island and Big Diomede Island, you're like, one of them is the United States, one of them is Russia, and they're very close together. So it's not unreasonable to say you could have done it on small boats. It's unreasonable, perhaps, to move as many people as we think moved across that area. So it's less of a who found it first. It's more that the Western world, Europe, did not know it existed. And the East, so Asia, did not know that that this land existed. Essentially, the only people who knew that this land existed were the people who had already relocated there. So the First Nations tribes are established there. So when we talk about discovering America, it's discovering America from the European perspective. So who finds it first for the Europeans? Well, sadly, Columbus is going to lose out there as well, because somewhere around 985, the Vikings, led by Eric the Red, discover Greenland. Somewhere around 1001 AD, the Viking Leif Erikson, he's Eric the Red's son, see, Eric's son, comes to the Americas. He gets as far west as what he calls Vineland or Vinland. And if you looked at your reading from yesterday, then that will be in there, and you'll also see the map of Viking lands and Viking discoveries. Later British explorers are going to call this the Newfound Land, or Newfoundland, as we call it today. We're not going to do that right now, but we will later. All right. Have a lovely day. You know what? We're going to keep going. We're going to just brief overview. Stick with me. It's going to be great. So, the Vikings we're going to talk about as we move through the Age of Exploration are Olaf Thorgilsson, Eric the Red, Thorvaldsson, and Leif Erikson. So, those three guys, we really don't know a lot about the Viking exploration because the Norse did oral tradition. They did not record, they did not write down a lot of their stories, and so their history is kind of fragmented, but we have some great historical things that we've unearthed, so archaeological evidence that supports the oral tradition. But we don't have a lot of names for famous Viking explorers. Exploring for Portugal, you have Bartholomew Diaz, Vasco da Gama, Amerigo Vespucci, probably a name or two in there that you have heard before. Exploring for the Netherlands, we're going to talk about Henry Hudson. For England, but wait, Mr. Zender, that's not England's flag. Au contraire, my friends. The UK's flag looks like this. It's called the Union Jack. No. But yes. Silly rabbit. Actually, that's the Union flag, unless it's being flown at sea. Then it's the Union Jack. A ship's national flags have special names. The one flown on the bow, the front of a ship, is called the Jack. The flag on the stern is called the ensign. Usually, the flag on the back, the ensign, is your entire national flag. Oftentimes, the one in the front, the Jack, is a smaller, like just a slice of your flag. For example, here in the United States, the ensign of the United States is the normal U.S. flag. But the Jack of the United States is just the Union, just the blue rectangle with the stars in it. True story. So, the more you know. Additionally, the UK's Union flag didn't even exist until 1801, about 300 years after Columbus. So this is totes not the flag that they were flying during the Age of Exploration. So what did they have before that, Mr. Zender? I am so glad you asked. This is how it works. Essentially, because England's flag is a white field with the red cross of St. George, when eventually you had this guy named King James, James was a Scottish king who, after Elizabeth's death, also became King of England. So he took the Scottish flag, the St. Andrew's cross, blue field with a white cross on it, and the white field with a red cross on it, and he superimposed them into what's called the King's Colors, or the Grand Union flag. Later on, part of Ireland is acquired, well, all of Ireland is acquired at this point, and you have St. Patrick's cross, the red X on a white field, which is then superimposed again to give you the Union flag of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, or you have the Union Jack if it's on a ship. If you are wondering why Wales, the one with the dragon, does not get to be included, it is a principality, it is not a kingdom, so it's not part of the United Kingdoms, and so it's not on the flag. Sorry. But exploring for England, Henry Hudson, yes, the same guy for the Netherlands, John Cabot, or Giovanni Caboto, Sebastian Cabot, his son, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Sir Francis Drake. Exploring for France, you also have Jacques Cartier, not the watch guy, Samuel de Champlain, yes, Lake Champlain, Jean Ribault, Jacques Marquette, René Robert Chevalier de La Salle, normally we just call him de La Salle in this country, and Louis Joliet. So, exploring for Spain, we have Christopher Columbus, Vasco Nunez de Balboa, normally we just call him Balboa, Ferdinand Magellan, Francisco Pizarro, Hernando de Soto, normally just call him de Soto, Hernan Cortez, or Hernando Cortez, they're the same guy, Juan de Onate, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, Cow's Head, great guy, great story, you're going to love it. Francisco Vasco de Coronado, normally we just call him Coronado, Juan Ponce de Leon, Pedro Menendez de Aviles. If those sound familiar, those two are of special importance here in Florida. Ponce de Leon, because, Florida and the Fountain of Youth and that whole thing. And Pedro Menendez is actually the guy who's in charge of St. Augustine. So we're going to be talking about each of those explorers and actually many more in great, exhaustive detail to this wonderful thing called ad nauseam. That means to the point where you are sick to your stomach of it. It's going to be great. These are a lot of fun. I really like doing the Age of Exploration, and I hope that you guys will too. All right. Have a very, very great day, and I will talk to you again soon.